In this lecture, we'll be taking a closer look at what some would consider a brother or sister to Marxist theory, in this case, radical or critical theory. Where these two schools of thought begin to diverge relates to causality and how each theoretical school of thought looks at the causes of deviant behavior. When you take a look at a Marxist approach, again, the idea of hegemony and struggle are at the core of this both historical and economic school of thought. When you compare that or juxtapose that to radical or critical theory, you're moving into an area that is looking more at narrative. And as such, you're also moving into a school of thought that can be aligned with both a modernist or late modernist and a postmodernist period of thought within higher ed and academia. And this is something we see really emerging in the late 1960s, but then hitting its kind of stride in the late 70s and early 80s. When we look at the real-world applications for radical or critical theory, in this case applications in criminal justice research or criminology, we could begin by looking at the writings of Henry and Milanovic. These two researchers really, in a sense, give us a middle-of-the-road perspective regarding what critical theory is. Probably the largest school of thought regarding critical theory, but one that is rarely tested, is constitutive criminology. The focus here is how deviant behavior at its base level develops. And when we take a look at constitutive criminology and how it is, in a sense, being utilized and applied in a postmodernist fashion, we realize that dialogue or discourse or narrative become the important, or becomes a rather important component of how and why people choose to commit crime, or at least how we explain that behavioral choice. But what we have to realize is that there are two levels to this expression of hegemony and choice. First, we have the kind of micro level, the small level, which is the individual and their everyday connections. This would include things like the influence of one's peers. Beyond that, then we have a macro level or a structural or societal level. This would be constitutive of how a particular society, its social values, ultimately the culture that is connected with, how all of that will ultimately be a factor in how and why people on a much larger scale commit crimes. The principal idea here, however, is that crime and choices regarding deviance are very much of an individual, or are understood rather on an individual level, and that the crimes themselves can be viewed more as a form of kind of discursive production rather than a more observable behavioral act. The idea here is that we're looking at the voices, we're looking at the messages, we're looking at the ideas which underpin the causality for the behavior. So too, in a constitutive criminological perspective, or point of view that incorporates this perspective, the ideas that how we talk about crime, how we talk about a deviant act, how we attempt to explain that act, and then, of course, how we attempt to control it are all, in a sense, co-determined. They're all interdependent, and they're all aspects of the larger phenomenon of that act occurring, whether it's at an individual or group level. Now, as you can imagine, this is a very, very hard school of thought to apply to research. And so it's very seldom that you will see a kind of pure critical theory being applied to the explanation of crime projections, or the explanation of how and why subcultures are participating in group behaviors that are considered to be deviant, or how and why individuals may look at the same behavior, but one may believe that it is perfectly viable, where another is looking at it as true deviance. So, what we have seen in terms of the research, uh, again, research applying this kind of critical thought, is that we have several related but different schools of thought that are receiving a lot more attention. And we'll highlight just two of those in this lecture. Probably the most popular of the two that I have on this particular slide fits into the kind of cultural application, in this case, cultural criminology. And scholars associated with this, Jeff Farrell, for example, they are taking a look at values and beliefs, social norms, moral convictions, even structural symbolic meanings regarding, in this case, not only why people choose to behave in a particular way, but what lies at the heart of that individual choice. It does not, in this case, remain, though, isolated to the kind of micro level or individual or group level. It expands immediately outside of this to take a look at how the culture behaves in relation to its observable society. The idea here is we're looking at a much larger scale social unit in the case of society, but then we're also taking a look at how the elements, the psychological elements of the culture, are being conveyed to individuals, and then what role that those elements are playing in individual choice. Again, still part of that narrative uh, kind of perspective. The research that will often accompany a kind of cultural criminology, or what some will refer to as a critical sociology, very often will relate very closely or very strongly with ethnographic field research in fields such as anthropology and sociology. The idea here is that researchers will go out into the community, they will talk with individuals, they'll live in the community, and they'll attempt to understand how and why behavioral choices are made. They will also attempt to tie everything back to how the society is built, how it's structured on a cultural level. They'll take a look at the different kinds of messages that people receive as they're being socialized, or they'll take a look at the larger, almost institutional expectations that are assigned to individuals and groups. The other quality of this cultural school that is very, very important lies in the notion of how crime is experienced, or how a deviant behavior is being experienced. The assumption here is that we can't just look at the criminal, we can't just look at the victim. We have to take all of that into consideration almost on an equal level. We also don't want to look just at the demographics regarding particular individuals who are practicing deviant behaviors, but we want to step back and take a much bolder look at some of the messaging that is associated, kind of symbolic messaging that is associated with how that group, that subculture, ultimately that culture is socialized, is in a sense introduced into the society, how you become a member of that society, and what messages, what discourse or discourses accompany that process of inclusion. And again, what makes this kind of a powerful application of critical thought is that it is something that is testable, and it is testable scientifically, or is scientifically testable. And it is also something that ultimately will be applicable to even the making of policy. So, taking a look in this case at a particular trend in criminal justice and attempting to consider what we can do on a society wide level to curb not only the act, but how the act is being experienced. And so, just kind of almost a reformatting of social perspectives regarding the how and why of nearly every behavior that is associated with a, a social, political, or economic cause. The other testable alternative to critical theory, or another form of critical theory that moves out of a very abstract kind of postmodernist or late modernist world of thought, is conflict or peacemaking criminology. And this one, I think you'll find if you do some background research on critical theory and radical theory and its applications in sociology, you'll find that this is being utilized considerably more than any of the other um, testable alternatives to critical thought, at least postmodern critical thought. And this, again, Harold Papinski and Richard Quinney are two names, again, that are very much associated with at least one manifestation of this criminology, this peacemaking criminology. And their perspective, too, is again, rooted in discourse, and it's rooted in the idea of kind of a non-judgmental, uh, two-way perspective regarding crime. What they see, in a sense, or what they look more closely at, is how things like the media and policing, uh, how victimization and violent acts in general contribute to, as a whole, to the experience of criminal behavior. They then declare that all criminological research, and of course any of the policymaking that is, in a sense, stimulated or grows from that kind of research, it all should be geared toward peacemaking. So, in a sense, it's stepping back and challenging a much larger scale, observable or even cognitive, a larger scale phenomenon, a society, a culture, and the people within those phenomena, to reevaluate what it means to be an individual, a person, to evaluate or to evaluate kind of the way others should be treated and the way that you or I should be treated in relation to other individuals. Now, this may sound very familiar to you when you think about it, because it really is kind of that golden mean that is pervasive in a lot of Semitic religions, a lot of philosophies associated with Western civilization, this idea of treat others how you would like to be treated. And so when they are looking at the how and why regarding deviant behavior, they don't stop there. They move beyond that, and they recognize that any sort of public solution for the how and why regarding a deviant act, that all has to be situated in the idea of kind of self-reflective thought. Religion is one area that has considerable influence in this peacemaking criminology. The idea that if one is more spiritual, if one has some sort of sense of right and wrong outside of oneself, that this can stimulate or curb particular kinds of acts, or the drives which underlie those acts. It can also be, and we see this in quite a bit of research as well, where if there are competing interests in the life of an individual, let's say something like a peer socialization and very negative kinds of ideas coming out of that, given a situation where a person lives or the friends that they choose to make, how a religious school of thought or a religious philosophy can, in a sense, counterbalance those kind of negative thoughts that you're receiving from looking at the actions of your friends and of others who are of a similar birth age. The irony here, is that when we look to social institutions such as a religious community or a religious perspective, as we look to those to find answers that are nonviolent in nature for curbing deviance in our society, we really start to look back toward that historically original theoretical perspective of Marxist theory, the idea that Marx would recognize social institutions as being very, very important for being able to move people beyond crime as an end game kind of decision for the experiences that they are having in their everyday lives, right? Giving them a different alternative, something that is outside of themselves, something that is governed by a larger segment of society, if not the culture itself. And so, again, looking to, in this case, social institutions to be active reformers in this kind of practice is something that would very much align itself with a Marxist perspective as well. So, in closing, when we look at cultural criminology or if we look at conflict criminology, we have two very usable, testable kinds of alternatives to radical or critical theory as it relates to criminal justice and reform. What is ironic here, though, is as you start to move into these testable forms of the school of thought, you find yourself outside of rigid, almost governmental kinds of applications for public policy making, things that would be a little more grassroots, things that would be a little bit more indicative of the community that an individual recognizes to be their own. And it does move you even further back in the history of criminological theory to a Marxist kind of approach. The idea that people experience firsthand hegemony and differential access to power in their societies, and that this is a important, often driving force that will stimulate not only good behavior, but also behavior that is considered by the majority of individuals to be negative or improper or deviant. And the, I guess, last major takeaway would be that all of these schools of thought fit into a much more recent chapter in the history of criminological theory. In this case, looking at how postmodernism as a global social and academic perspective has worked its way into how we study or analyze crime and deviance in our own societies.